They said her invention was impossible. They rejected her patent. But this black woman's groundbreaking idea became the foundation of an industry worth billions. Prepare to discover the untold story of how she not only fought back, but ultimately compelled the very company that spurned her to pay out an astronomical sum for the technology they once denied. If you're ready to hear a story about perseverance, justice, and the power of never giving up on your dreams, hit that subscribe button right now. This is a story that needs to be told, and you won't want to miss what happens next. Dr. Vivian Carter sat in the waiting room of TechCorp Industries' patent office in Silicon Valley, her leather portfolio clutched against her chest like armor. It was March 15, 1998, and the 28-year-old engineer had just driven 6 hours from her tiny apartment in Oakland to present what she knew, with absolute certainty, would change the world. Inside that portfolio were schematics, prototypes, and documentation for a revolutionary data compression algorithm that could reduce file sizes by up to 90% without quality loss. In an era when the internet was still crawling along on dial-up connections and a single high-resolution image could take minutes to download, Vivian's invention was nothing short of miraculous. She'd spent 3 years developing the algorithm, working nights and weekends while holding down a day job as a software engineer at a mid-sized tech company. Her colleagues there had been politely dismissive when she'd mentioned her project. Compression theory has been explored to death, they'd said. There's nothing new under the sun. But Vivian knew they were wrong. She'd found something everyone else had missed, a mathematical pattern hidden in the way human perception processed visual information, a way to eliminate redundancy that no one had thought to exploit. The receptionist, a young white woman with perfectly manicured nails, barely looked up when Vivian approached. Name? Dr. Vivian Carter. I have a 2 o'clock appointment with the Patent Review Board. The receptionist's eyes flicked up briefly, taking in Vivian's appearance. The natural hair she wore in careful twists, the professional but clearly not designer suit, the nervous energy of someone who didn't quite belong in these gleaming corporate halls. Have a seat. Someone will be with you. Vivian waited for 45 minutes past her scheduled appointment time. She watched as 3 other inventors, all white men in expensive suits, were called in for their appointments, which had been scheduled after hers. She said nothing, just gripped her portfolio tighter and rehearsed her presentation in her mind. When they finally called her name, she was led into a conference room where 4 men sat around a massive table. None of them stood when she entered. None of them introduced themselves. The man at the head of the table, silver-haired and wearing a watch that probably cost more than Vivian's car, gestured impatiently at a chair. Dr. Carter, you have 15 minutes to present your patent application. Make it count. 15 minutes. The other inventors had been given an hour each. Vivian had watched them through the conference room's glass walls, seen them laughing and chatting with the board members, building rapport before diving into their presentations, but she didn't waste time protesting. She launched into her presentation with practiced precision, explaining the mathematical foundation of her algorithm, demonstrating its real-world applications, showing the prototype she'd built that could compress a 5-megabyte image file down to 500 kilobytes in under 3 seconds. The men listened with expressions ranging from boredom to barely concealed skepticism. When she finished, the silver-haired man didn't even look at her schematics. Dr. Carter, he said, his voice dripping with condescension, what you're describing violates fundamental principles of information theory. Shannon's theorem clearly establishes the limits of lossless compression. What you're claiming is, frankly, impossible. With respect, sir, my algorithm isn't purely lossless. It's perceptually lossless. It preserves the information that human perception actually notices while eliminating. We understand the concept of lossy compression, another man interrupted, his tone suggesting she'd just explained something insultingly basic. JPEG compression already does this. What you're describing isn't novel. But it is novel, Vivian insisted, her voice steady despite the frustration building in her chest. My algorithm uses an entirely different approach to identify perceptual redundancy. The math is completely original. If you just look at the technical documentation, Mr. Carter, Dr. Carter. The correction hung in the air like a challenge. The silver-haired man's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Dr. Carter, he said, emphasizing the title with barely disguised mockery. "We've reviewed your application. The board's determination is that your invention lacks sufficient novelty to warrant patent protection. Furthermore, the claims you're making about compression ratios are, quite simply, not credible. We see dozens of applications like this every month, hopeful inventors claiming to have solved problems that actual experts have been working on for decades." "I have a PhD in computer science from Stanford," Vivian said quietly. "I am an actual expert." "Be that as it may, your patent application is denied. You'll receive official notification in writing within 30 days. Good afternoon." They dismissed her without looking at a single page of her technical documentation, without examining her working prototype, without asking a single meaningful technical question. The entire meeting had lasted 12 minutes. Vivian walked out of that building with her portfolio still clutched to her chest and tears of rage burning behind her eyes. She sat in her car for 20 minutes before she trusted herself to drive, staring at the gleaming TechCorp tower and feeling the full weight of what had just happened. They hadn't rejected her invention because it didn't work. They'd rejected it because they didn't believe someone like her could have created something so revolutionary. A black woman in her 20s, working alone out of a cramped apartment, claiming to have solved a problem that white men with prestigious pedigrees and unlimited resources had failed to crack. But Vivian Carter wasn't the type to give up. She'd faced this kind of dismissal her entire life. In her undergraduate program where professors assumed she was only there because of affirmative action, in her graduate work where her research contributions were routinely attributed to her white male colleagues, in every job interview where she had to prove she was twice as qualified to be considered half as competent. She'd learned to document everything, to build undeniable proof, to be so meticulously prepared that doubt became impossible, and that's exactly what she would do now. Over the next 6 months, Vivian filed patent applications with 3 other companies. Each one rejected her with similar dismissive language. "Lacks novelty. Claims not credible. Violates established principles." One patent examiner actually suggested she go back and study the fundamentals before wasting everyone's time with applications. But Vivian noticed something interesting in those rejection letters. They all came back remarkably quickly, sometimes within days of submission, and they all cited the same technical objections, using similar language, as if they'd been coordinated. She also noticed that her prototype, which she'd left briefly with TechCorp for their technical review, had been handled in a way that suggested more than casual examination. When it was returned to her, there were signs it had been thoroughly analyzed, scratches on the casing where it had been opened, subtle differences in how components had been reassembled. Someone had been very interested in her invention, even if they had pretended not to be. Vivian understood what was happening, even if she couldn't yet prove it. In the late 1990s tech industry, dominated by white men and venture capital-funded startups racing to stake claims in the emerging internet economy, a lone black woman inventor represented either an opportunity to exploit or a threat to eliminate, never an equal to respect. But she wasn't alone, not really. Vivian was part of a long legacy of black inventors who'd faced similar obstacles. She thought about Garrett Morgan, who'd invented the traffic signal and the gas mask but had to hire a white man to present his inventions because no one would take a black inventor seriously. She thought about Marie Van Britten Brown, who'd invented the home security system in the 1960s and struggled for recognition. She thought about all the black women in STEM fields who'd had their contributions erased, their ideas stolen, their genius denied. And she thought about how every single one of those inventors had persevered anyway, had fought for recognition, had changed the world despite the systems designed to stop them. If they could do it, so could she. Vivian made a decision. If no one would give her a patent, she'd build the proof they couldn't ignore. She'd create a company, launch products using her technology, establish such clear documentation of her invention's timeline and capabilities that when the inevitable theft occurred, and she was certain it would, she'd have an ironclad case. She withdrew her meager savings, took out loans she could barely afford, and founded Carter Technologies in a spare bedroom of her apartment. She hired 2 recent graduates, both women of color who'd faced their own struggles in tech, And together they built the first commercial product using Vivian's compression algorithm. It was an image optimization tool for web developers, something simple and practical that would demonstrate the algorithm's real-world value. They launched it in September 1999 with minimal marketing budget, selling it through shareware distribution and word of mouth. Within 6 months, they had 50,000 users. Within a year, 200,000. Web developers couldn't believe how well it worked. Images that loaded instantly, websites that performed smoothly even on the slowest connections. Carter Technologies software was becoming essential infrastructure for the early web, one download at a time. And Vivian documented everything. Every line of code was time-stamped and archived. Every development decision was recorded in meticulous detail. Every user testimonial was saved. She was building not just a company, but a fortress of evidence. Because she knew what was coming. She could see it in the way TechCorp had started releasing vague announcements about revolutionary compression technology and development. She could feel it in the sudden interest venture capitalists showed in compression startups. She could sense it in the patterns emerging across the industry. They were going to steal her invention. They were going to pretend they'd developed it independently. And when they did, Vivian Carter would be ready. Before we continue, I want to ask you something. Have you ever had an idea dismissed or stolen? Have you ever felt like the system was designed to keep you out? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience matters, and you're not alone in this fight. And if you're invested in seeing how Vivian fights back, make sure you're subscribed. What happens next is absolutely incredible. The first time Vivian saw her algorithm in someone else's product, she was sitting in a coffee shop in San Francisco, trying to debug a particularly stubborn piece of code. It was June 2001, 3 years after TechCorp had rejected her patent application, and Carter Technologies had grown to 15 employees and nearly 1 million users worldwide. The man at the next table was showing his colleagues something on his laptop, a new software product from TechCorp called Instant Image Pro. Vivian couldn't help but overhear their conversation. "This compression is insane," the man was saying. "I'm getting 90% file size reduction with basically no quality loss. Our entire website loads in under 2 seconds now." 90% reduction. Vivian's heart started pounding. She casually leaned slightly toward their table, pretending to stretch, getting a glimpse of the laptop screen. The interface was different from her software, more polished and professional, but the compression ratios being displayed, the speed of processing, the way the progress bar moved in distinctive bursts rather than smooth progression, all of it was eerily familiar. That evening, Vivian purchased a copy of Instant Image Pro using a pseudonym. She took it back to her office and ran it through a battery of tests, analyzing not just what it did, but how it did it. She examined the compressed files at a binary level, looking for fingerprints of the underlying algorithm. What she found made her blood run cold and her resolve harden like steel. The algorithm wasn't just similar to hers. The core mathematical approach, the specific way it identified and eliminated perceptual redundancy, the unique pattern of how it reconstructed visual information, it was her work. Not an independent development that happened to reach the same conclusions. Not a parallel invention that coincidentally used similar methods. It was her algorithm stolen and repackaged with just enough surface-level changes to provide plausible deniability. But Vivian had been preparing for this moment for 3 years. She pulled out her meticulously maintained documentation, time-stamped source code from 1997, patent applications from 1998, product launches from 1999. She had an unbroken chain of evidence proving she'd invented this technology years before TechCorp claimed to have developed it. She hired a patent attorney named Richard Chen, one of the few Asian American lawyers specializing in intellectual property theft cases. Richard had a reputation for taking on major corporations and, more importantly, for believing inventors when they said they'd been robbed. "This is going to be ugly," Richard told her during their first meeting, after reviewing her documentation. "TechCorp is a $30 billion company with unlimited legal resources. They'll bury us in motions and delays. They'll question every piece of evidence. They'll try to destroy your credibility. Are you prepared for that?" "I've been preparing for this my entire life," Vivian said quietly. "They've underestimated me once. Let them do it again." But Richard was right about one thing. It was ugly from the start. Vivian sent TechCorp a cease and desist letter in July 2001, demanding they stop selling Instant Image Pro and compensate her for the infringement. TechCorp's response came from a team of 5 attorneys whose combined billable hours probably exceeded Vivian's annual salary. Their letter was a masterclass in corporate intimidation. They denied any infringement, claimed their technology was developed entirely independently by their world-class engineering team, and suggested that if Vivian persisted with these baseless accusations, they would have no choice but to countersue for defamation and tortious interference with business relationships. They were betting she'd back down, that she'd lack the resources or the courage to fight a legal battle against a corporate giant, that she'd be like so many other small inventors who'd been crushed under the weight of expensive litigation and eventually disappeared, their complaints forgotten. They didn't know Vivian Carter. She filed a patent infringement lawsuit in federal court in August 2001. The case was officially titled Carter Technologies, Inc. v. TechCorp Industries, Inc. But everyone who followed it knew it was really Vivian Carter versus the entire Silicon Valley establishment that had told her she wasn't good enough, smart enough, or credible enough to invent something revolutionary. The case proceeded slowly, as these things do. TechCorp filed motion after motion to dismiss, arguing that Vivian's evidence was insufficient, that her patents, she'd finally secured one in 2000 through a smaller independent patent office, were invalid, that she was engaging in a shakedown of a legitimate company. Meanwhile, something interesting was happening in the marketplace. Instant Image Pro was becoming huge. By 2002, it was the industry standard for image compression, used by millions of websites and designers. TechCorp's stock price soared as the product generated hundreds of millions in revenue. And quietly, persistently, Vivian documented all of it. Every TechCorp press release claiming they'd pioneered compression technology. Every interview where their executives took credit for innovation that wasn't theirs. Every dollar of profit built on stolen intellectual property. She also noticed something else. Her own product, Carter Technologies' original compression software, was being systematically shut out of the market. Companies that had been her customers suddenly switched to Instant Image Pro. Trade publications that had praised her software now ignored it in favor of TechCorp's superior solution. Industry conferences that had invited her to speak suddenly had no available slots. It was a coordinated effort to erase her from the narrative, to make it seem like TechCorp had always been the innovator and she was just a late-coming copycat making false claims. But Vivian had allies, even if they weren't immediately visible. Other inventors who'd been robbed by major corporations reached out with advice and support. Organizations advocating for underrepresented inventors offered resources and connections. Journalists who specialized in tech industry investigative reporting started asking questions. One of those journalists was Maya Patel, a reporter for a major technology news outlet who'd been following stories about patent theft and the systematic exclusion of minority inventors from the tech industry's innovation narrative. Maya reached out to Vivian in 2003 as the lawsuit was grinding through its early stages. "I want to tell your story," Maya said during their first phone call. "Not just the legal case, but the bigger picture. How the tech industry treats Black women inventors. How innovation gets stolen and credit gets redistributed along racial and gender lines. Would you be willing to talk?" Vivian's attorney advised caution. Anything she said publicly could potentially be used against her in court. But Vivian understood something her attorney didn't. This case wasn't just about legal precedent and patent law. It was about narrative control, about who gets to be seen as an innovator, about whether the system would continue to allow the theft of intellectual property from marginalized inventors. She agreed to the interview. Maya's article, published in September 2003, was titled, "The Algorithm They Couldn't Believe a Black Woman Invented." It told Vivian's story in meticulous detail. The patent rejection, the dismissive treatment, the suspicious similarities between her technology and TechCorp's product, the legal battle she was waging against impossible odds. The article went viral, as much as anything could go viral in 2003. It was shared across tech forums, discussed on Slashdot, picked up by mainstream news outlets. Suddenly, Vivian Carter wasn't just another inventor claiming theft. She was a symbol of everything wrong with Silicon Valley's diversity problem and its treatment of outsider innovation. TechCorp's public relations team went into damage control mode. They issued statements emphasizing their commitment to diversity, their respect for all inventors, their absolute certainty that their technology was developed independently. They pointed to their world-class engineering team and their rigorous development process. But Maya Patel wasn't done. She started investigating TechCorp's engineering team, looking into who had actually developed Instant Image Pro. What she found was explosive. 3 of the 5 engineers credited with developing the compression algorithm had left the company under mysterious circumstances shortly after the product launched. 2 of them, when contacted by Maya, refused to comment but seemed uncomfortable with questions about the technology's origins. The third, a man named David Rodriguez, who'd been fired in 2002, was more forthcoming. "We were told to reverse engineer existing compression software," David told Maya, speaking on condition of anonymity initially, "to look at what was out there and build something better. And yeah, we looked at Carter Technologies software. We looked at it very carefully. The bosses said it was for competitive analysis. But looking back, I think we were basically told to copy it and change it just enough that it looked different." David eventually agreed to go on record, and Maya published a follow-up article in February 2004. This one was even more damaging to TechCorp. Here was their own former engineer, confirming what Vivian had been saying all along, that Instant Image Pro wasn't an independent invention, but a deliberate appropriation of her technology. The tide was starting to turn, but the legal battle was far from over. TechCorp still had resources Vivian couldn't match, and they were using every tool at their disposal to drag out the case, hoping she'd run out of money or energy or faith. They didn't understand that for Vivian, this was never just about money or credit. It was about every black girl who'd been told she wasn't smart enough, every woman of color in STEM who'd had her ideas dismissed, every inventor from a marginalized community who'd watched their innovations get stolen and repackaged by people with more power and privilege. She wasn't fighting just for herself, she was fighting for all of them, and she wasn't going to stop. By 2005, the case had been dragging on for 4 years, and Vivian Carter was exhausted. Not broken, never broken, but worn down by the relentless grind of litigation. Her company, Carter Technologies, had struggled to survive while she poured resources into the lawsuit. She'd laid off half her staff, taken no salary for 18 months, maxed out every credit card and line of credit she could access. There were nights when she sat alone in her office, staring at the ceiling and wondering if she was being stubborn to the point of self-destruction. If maybe Richard was right when he suggested they consider a settlement, something small, enough to keep the company afloat and allow her to move on with her life. But then she'd think about that patent office, about the silver-haired man who dismissed her without looking at her work. She'd think about every little black girl who dreamed of becoming an inventor or an engineer, and what message it would send if she gave up now. She'd think about her grandmother, who'd worked as a maid in white people's homes and told young Vivian, "Baby, you're going to be so much more than I ever could be. You're going to make them see you." And Vivian would get up the next morning and keep fighting. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. In March 2005, a TechCorp employee named Jennifer Kim reached out through an anonymous email account. Jennifer worked in the company's product development archives, and she'd stumbled across something that troubled her conscience enough to take an enormous risk. "I found internal memos from 1998, the email read. They discuss your patent application. They discuss ways to acquire the technology without acknowledging the inventor. I have copies. If you can guarantee my anonymity, I'll provide them." Vivian and Richard worked with Jennifer through encrypted channels, carefully establishing her credibility and securing the documents she'd found. What emerged was devastating to TechCorp's defense. The internal memos showed that TechCorp's Patent Review Board hadn't rejected Vivian's application because they thought it was impossible or lacked novelty. They'd rejected it specifically because they wanted to develop the technology themselves without having to compensate her or acknowledge her invention. One memo written by the silver-haired man who dismissed Vivian, a senior vice president named Robert Thornton, was particularly damning. The Carter algorithm is genuinely novel and represents a significant breakthrough in compression technology. However, given the inventor's lack of institutional backing and resources, we recommend denial of the patent application, followed by independent development of similar technology. The competitive advantage this represents is too valuable to cede to an outside inventor. In other words, they'd recognized her genius and decided to steal it because they thought she couldn't fight back. The documents also showed that TechCorp had deliberately targeted her prototype for analysis, extracting the technical specifications they needed to replicate her algorithm. They'd even discussed the minimal changes necessary to create plausible deniability of direct copying. Richard filed the new evidence in June 2005, along with a motion for summary judgment. The documents were sealed initially, but word leaked to the press, likely from Jennifer Kim, who'd become increasingly willing to risk exposure to see justice done. Maya Patel got the story first. Smoking gun, internal docs show TechCorp deliberately stole black inventor's patent, read the headline. The article detailed the memos, the calculated theft, the cynical assumption that Vivian wouldn't have the resources to fight back. The public reaction was swift and severe. Tech workers, many of whom had their own stories of being undervalued or having ideas stolen, organized protests outside TechCorp's headquarters. Customers began boycotting Instant Image Pro, switching back to Carter Technologies' software despite its less polished interface. Industry leaders who'd previously ignored the case suddenly started making statements about the importance of protecting all inventors' intellectual property rights. TechCorp's stock price dropped 12% in a week. Their CEO was forced to testify before Congress about the company's practices regarding patent applications and intellectual property. It was becoming a national scandal, a symbol of everything wrong with Silicon Valley's culture of appropriation and its treatment of outsider inventors. But TechCorp still fought. Even with the internal memos exposed, they argued that the documents didn't prove actual infringement, only that they'd considered developing similar technology. They claimed their engineers had ultimately created something different through independent development. They pointed to technical differences in how the algorithms processed certain edge cases. The case finally went to trial in September 2006. It had been 8 years since Vivian's patent application was rejected. 8 years of fighting against a system designed to protect established power rather than recognize genuine innovation. The trial lasted 6 weeks. Vivian testified for 3 days, walking the jury through her invention's development, explaining the mathematics in terms they could understand, describing the rejection and the subsequent theft. She was poised, articulate, and utterly credible. The defense tried to undermine her, suggesting she'd actually copied the algorithm from obscure academic papers, implying she'd fabricated her timeline of development, questioning whether someone with her limited resources could have actually created something so sophisticated. It was Richard Chen's cross-examination of Robert Thornton that turned the trial decisively in Vivian's favor. Richard methodically walked Thornton through his own memo, forcing him to explain each damning sentence. When you wrote that Dr. Carter's algorithm was genuinely novel, what did you mean? Richard asked. I was speaking theoretically. We didn't fully evaluate. But you did evaluate it, didn't you? You had her prototype. You analyzed it thoroughly. That's in the memo, too. Technical analysis confirms breakthrough methodology, you wrote. Were you lying in your memo to your colleagues, Mr. Thornton? Thornton had no good answer. Either he'd lied in the memo or he'd lied in court. Either way, his credibility was destroyed. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous. TechCorp had willfully infringed on Vivian Carter's patent. They were liable for damages, both the actual damages from 8 years of stolen profits and punitive damages for the deliberate nature of the theft. The judge would determine the exact amount, but legal experts were already speculating it would be enormous. Instant Image Pro had generated over $2 billion in revenue since its launch. Even a fraction of that could represent the largest patent infringement award in history. Vivian sat in the courtroom as the verdict was read, Richard gripping her hand, and allowed herself to cry. Not from relief or happiness, though she felt both, but from the recognition that she'd done something that mattered beyond herself. She'd proven that the system, however stacked against her, could still be forced to deliver justice if you fought hard enough and long enough. This is the moment that changes everything. The moment when 8 years of struggle and sacrifice finally pay off. If this story is giving you chills, if you're feeling that justice might actually be possible even when the odds are impossible, hit that like button and drop a comment telling us what this means to you. And stay with us, because what happens next is even more incredible than the verdict itself. The damages hearing took place over 3 months, from January to March 2007. It was in many ways more complex than the trial itself. Vivian's legal team had to prove not just that TechCorp had stolen her invention, but exactly how much profit they'd made from that theft and how much she was owed as a result. TechCorp's attorneys fought every number, every calculation, every assumption. They tried to argue that Instant Image Pro's success was due to their marketing, their brand recognition, their distribution channels, that the algorithm itself was just one small component of a much larger product. But Richard Chen was relentless. He brought in forensic accountants who traced every dollar of revenue directly attributable to the compression technology. He showed how Instant Image Pro had cannibalized the market for competing products, including Vivian's own software. He demonstrated that TechCorp's stock price increases were directly correlated to Instant Image Pro's success, enriching shareholders by billions. The financial picture that emerged was staggering. From 2001 to 2007, Instant Image Pro had generated $2.3 billion in direct revenue. It had also driven adoption of other TechCorp products, contributing indirectly to another $1.8 billion in associated sales. The technology had become so fundamental to TechCorp's business model that the company now licensed it to other corporations, generating an additional revenue stream of hundreds of millions annually. All of it built on technology that Vivian Carter had invented in her apartment, that TechCorp had rejected and then stolen. The judge, a 60-year-old black woman named Sandra Mitchell, who'd been one of the first African-American federal judges appointed in the Northern District of California, took her time with the decision. She made it clear in court that she understood the historical significance of the case, that it represented not just one inventor's fight, but a broader reckoning with how the innovation economy had systematically excluded and exploited marginalized creators. On March 23, 2007, Judge Mitchell delivered her ruling. This case represents one of the most egregious examples of patent infringement this court has ever seen. She began, her voice carrying the weight of decades of legal experience and personal understanding of discrimination. The defendant did not stumble accidentally into infringement. They did not independently develop similar technology in good faith. They deliberately, systematically, and cynically stole the plaintiff's invention, banking on the assumption that a young black woman would lack the resources and resolve to hold them accountable. Judge Mitchell awarded Vivian $1.2 billion in actual damages, roughly half of Instant Image Pro's direct revenue, accounting for the value of TechCorp's marketing and distribution, but recognizing that the core technology was entirely Vivian's. Then came the punitive damages. The purpose of punitive damages is not merely to compensate the victim, but to punish the wrongdoer and deter future misconduct, Judge Mitchell continued. In this case, the defendant's conduct was so willful, so calculated, and so contemptuous of the plaintiff's rights that substantial punitive damages are warranted. She awarded an additional $2.4 billion in punitive damages, double the actual damages, a clear message that this kind of theft would not be tolerated. The total, $3.6 billion. It was the largest patent infringement award in history, larger than the Apple-Samsung disputes, larger than the pharmaceutical patent cases, a number so vast that it made international headlines and sent TechCorp's stock price plummeting 23% in a single day. Vivian sat in the courtroom, listening to the number echo in the vast space, and felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in 9 years: vindication. TechCorp immediately announced they would appeal, of course. Their CEO held a press conference where he expressed disappointment with the ruling and maintained that they developed their technology independently. But his words rang hollow, especially when reporters asked pointed questions about the internal memos and Robert Thornton's testimony. The appeals process would take years, legal experts predicted. TechCorp would fight to reduce the damages, to find technical errors in the trial, to delay payment as long as possible. They had nearly infinite resources to throw at the problem. But something had shifted in the culture around the case. The verdict had captured public imagination in a way the trial itself hadn't. Here was a story of David versus Goliath, of a black woman inventor standing up to a corporate giant and winning. It resonated far beyond the tech industry. Celebrities started tweeting about Vivian's case. Other inventors came forward with their own stories of having ideas stolen by major corporations. Congressional hearings were held about patent office bias and the need for stronger protections for independent inventors, particularly those from underrepresented communities. And crucially, TechCorp's corporate customers started getting nervous. If the company had stolen one inventor's technology, what else might they have appropriated? Were customers who licensed TechCorp's products exposed to legal liability themselves? Major clients began demanding indemnification clauses and audit rights. Some started quietly exploring alternative solutions, not wanting to be associated with a company that had become synonymous with theft and discrimination. By June 2007, 3 months after the verdict, TechCorp's stock had lost 40% of its value. The company was facing shareholder lawsuits, customer defections, and a PR disaster that no amount of spin could fix. Their new CEO, the previous one had been forced out, was a woman named Patricia Wong, brought in specifically to repair the company's reputation and deal with the Vivian Carter situation. Patricia had built her career on turning around troubled companies, and she understood something her predecessors hadn't. The only way out was through. She reached out to Vivian's legal team with a settlement proposal. TechCorp would pay the full $3.6 billion judgment, plus interest. They would publicly acknowledge that Vivian had invented the compression algorithm at the heart of Instant Image Pro. They would provide her with a royalty-free license to use any improvements they'd made to her technology, and they would commit to funding a $500 million initiative to support underrepresented inventors, particularly black women in STEM fields. In exchange, Vivian would agree not to pursue further legal action related to the case and would grant TechCorp a license to continue using her algorithm, albeit with proper compensation going forward. Richard advised caution. They might still lose the appeal and owe even more, he pointed out. We have the momentum. But Vivian had never been in this for revenge or to destroy TechCorp. She wanted justice, recognition, and the resources to help other inventors who faced what she'd faced. Take the deal, she told Richard. Let's end this and start building something better. The settlement was announced in August 2007. TechCorp's stock actually rose on the news. Investors relieved that the uncertainty was over and impressed by the company's commitment to the diversity initiative. Vivian Carter, at 37 years old, was suddenly one of the wealthiest self-made women in America. Not because someone had funded her startup or because she'd sold a company, but because she'd fought for 9 years to be recognized for her own genius. The payment came in 2 installments, $2 billion immediately, the remainder within 12 months. When the first payment cleared her account, Vivian sat in her office. She'd kept the same small space in Oakland throughout the entire ordeal and looked at the number on her computer screen. $2 billion. It seemed abstract, meaningless, not because of the amount, but because money had never been the point. The point had been recognition. The point had been justice. The point had been proving that a black woman's invention mattered, that her work had value, that she couldn't be erased or dismissed or stolen from without consequence. She thought about calling her mother, who'd supported her through every setback and believed in her even when belief seemed irrational. She thought about her small, loyal team at Carter Technologies, who'd stuck with her through layoffs and uncertainty because they believed in what she was building. Instead, she opened a new document on her computer and started writing. She was going to use this money to change the entire innovation ecosystem, to make sure what happened to her could never happen to another inventor from a marginalized community. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. In January 2026, nearly 20 years after that historic verdict, the Vivian Carter Institute for Innovation and Equity occupies a stunning glass and steel building in downtown Oakland. The institute provides free legal support for inventors facing patent theft, offers grants and resources for underrepresented innovators, and runs educational programs, teaching young people from marginalized communities about intellectual property rights and the innovation economy. Since its founding in 2008, the Carter Institute has supported over 10,000 inventors, predominantly women of color, in securing patents, fighting infringement, and building sustainable businesses around their innovations. It has funded legal battles that have resulted in another $12 billion in settlements and judgments for inventors who'd been robbed. It has helped launch 500 companies founded by people who'd been systematically excluded from venture capital and traditional funding channels. Dr. Vivian Carter, now 56, still comes to the office most days, though she's transitioned from CEO to board chair. She spends her time mentoring young inventors, testifying before Congress about patent reform, and writing. Her memoir, They Said It Was Impossible, A Black Woman's Fight for Justice in Silicon Valley, was published in 2024 and spent 40 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. But perhaps more importantly than any of that, Vivian's case fundamentally changed how patent offices and corporations approach inventors from underrepresented communities. The Carter precedent, as it's known in legal circles, established that willful infringement motivated by discrimination warrants severe punitive damages. It created a legal framework that makes it much more expensive and risky to steal from inventors that companies might have previously dismissed as unable to fight back. Patent offices have implemented bias training for examiners. They've established review processes specifically designed to catch a discrimination in patent evaluation. It's not perfect. Systemic bias doesn't disappear overnight, but it's better, measurably better. The percentage of patents granted to Black women inventors has increased by 300% since 2007. Major tech companies now have entire departments dedicated to ethical technology sourcing and inventor relations. They're terrified of becoming the next tech corp, of having their reputation destroyed and their stock price decimated because they stole from an inventor they thought was too powerless to fight back. TechCorp itself still exists, though it's a shadow of its former self. After the settlement, they struggled to rebuild trust. Many of their best engineers left, not wanting to be associated with a company that had engaged in such blatant theft. Their market share in compression technology dropped to less than 20%. Carter Technologies' improved version of the original algorithm now dominates the market. Interestingly, some good came from TechCorp's Mandatory Diversity Initiative. The $500 million fund they established has supported thousands of underrepresented innovators and created genuine opportunities where none existed before. Patricia Wong, the CEO who negotiated the settlement, stayed on and actually transformed the company's culture. She made TechCorp a leader in ethical innovation practices and diverse hiring. It's a redemption story of sorts, though one that never would have happened without Vivian forcing the reckoning. Robert Thornton, the executive who wrote those damning memos, was fired shortly after the verdict and never worked in tech again. He tried to publish a book portraying himself as a scapegoat, but no publisher would touch it. Justice doesn't always come in the form of legal verdicts. Sometimes it's just making sure bad actors can't continue to harm others. Richard Chen, Vivian's attorney, became one of the most sought-after intellectual property lawyers in the country. He takes on at least 5 pro bono cases per year, representing underrepresented inventors, and he's won every single one. He credits Vivian's case with teaching him that the law can be a tool for justice if you're willing to fight hard enough and long enough. Maya Patel, the journalist who first told Vivian's story to a wide audience, won a Pulitzer Prize for her investigative reporting on patent theft and discrimination in the tech industry. She continues to cover these issues, though she jokes that she's never found another story quite as satisfying as watching Vivian take down TechCorp. But for all the systemic changes and legal precedents, what Vivian is most proud of is something smaller and more personal. Every year, the Carter Institute hosts a summit bringing together hundreds of inventors from marginalized communities. They share their work, find collaborators, learn from each other, and build the networks that have been historically denied to them. At the 2025 summit, a 15-year-old Black girl from Mississippi presented an invention, a water purification system that could provide clean drinking water in disaster zones at a fraction of current costs. She was brilliant, articulate, and absolutely certain of her invention's value. After her presentation, she approached Vivian nervously. "Dr. Carter, I just wanted to say, I read your book, and it made me believe I could do this, that people would take me seriously." Vivian looked at this young girl, seeing herself 25 years ago, full of genius and hope and naivete about how hard the world would try to dismiss her. "They will take you seriously," Vivian said firmly. "And if they don't, you make them. You document everything. You build undeniable proof. And you never ever let anyone tell you that your invention isn't valuable just because they can't imagine someone like you creating it." The girl nodded, her eyes bright with determination. That, Vivian thought, was the real victory, not the $3.6 billion or the legal precedent or the Institute's success. It was every young inventor from a marginalized community who now believed they could fight back, who knew they weren't alone, who understood that the system could be forced to deliver justice even when it was designed to deny it. The innovation economy is still far from equitable. Black women still hold less than 1% of venture capital-funded startups. Patent offices still grant the overwhelming majority of patents to white men. The barriers that Vivian faced haven't disappeared, but they're cracking, slowly, persistently, because of people like Vivian who refuse to accept that genius only looked one way, that innovation only came from certain communities, that you could steal from someone just because you thought they couldn't fight back. In her office at the Carter Institute, Vivian keeps a framed copy of that first patent rejection letter from TechCorp, not as a reminder of pain, but as evidence of transformation. The letter that had seemed like the end of her dreams turned out to be the beginning of something much larger, a fight that changed not just her life, but the entire landscape of who gets to be seen as an innovator. Sometimes young inventors ask her if she ever regrets the 9 years she spent fighting TechCorp, the financial devastation, the emotional toll, the opportunities she missed because she was locked in a legal battle. "Not for a second," Vivian always says, "because I wasn't just fighting for myself. I was fighting for every person who'd been told they weren't good enough, smart enough, or credible enough to have created something valuable. And we won. Not just in court, but in changing what's possible. That's worth any sacrifice." The story of Vivian Carter and TechCorp has become legend in the innovation community, a cautionary tale for companies that think they can steal from inventors they consider powerless, and an inspiration for every underrepresented innovator who's been told their genius doesn't count. Because it does count. It always did. Vivian Carter proved that beyond any doubt. And in doing so, she didn't just win billions of dollars. She changed the world. If Vivian's story has inspired you, if it's made you think differently about who gets to be an innovator and how we protect their contributions, I need you to do something right now. Subscribe to this channel and share this video with someone who needs to hear the story. Comment below and tell us about the inventors and creators you admire who don't get enough recognition. And remember, genius comes from every community, every background, every identity. The only question is whether we have the courage to recognize it and fight for it when others try to steal it. Thank you for watching, and keep fighting for what's right.